Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Plaistow Potable Water meeting for June 29th. I would like to call this meeting to order at 6:30 p.m. And Beth, may I have a roll call, please?
Select Chair, Ms. Hart.
Here.
Select Vice Chair, Mr. Italian.
Here.
Selectman Mr. Plaistow.
Here.
Selectman Mr. Glenn.
He is excused.
Selectman Mr. DeRoche.
Here.
All right, thank you.
For the record, Town Manager Mr. Pearson is here. Attorney Radigan is here. We have Tim Moore from the planning board here. And joining us remotely, we have Dee Voss, Gene Forbes, and Keith Pratt.
All right, thank you. Would you all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance, please? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. So before I turn this meeting over to Jean, could I have a motion on the floor to approve the meeting minutes from
I'll make a
our
motion.
last meeting? Yes.
I'll make a motion that we approve the January 27th, 2020 Potable Water meeting minutes.
Seconded.
All righty. Is there any discussion on the minutes? No? All right. So seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstain? Abstain. All right. So the motion carries 301. All right. Thank you. So at this point in time, I would like to open up this workshop meeting and turn it over to Mr. Gene Forbes. Welcome, sir.
Good evening. Thank you for having this meeting and giving us the opportunity to bring you up to date on things. It's been quite a while since we met back in January, and a lot's been going on. I have a PowerPoint presentation. Have you all received copies of that, hard copies?
Yes, we do.
Great, great. I want to thank Beth for her help in getting that to you. Now, if I can figure out how to do my sharing here, what I'll do is I'll start with finding the PowerPoint myself.
Hey, Eugene, I just want to ask you, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I just want to make sure we had a good mics today.
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Now, can you see the introductory slide here of the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Great. So what I'd like to do is, I guess, first talk about who we are. You've met us before, but I think just to refresh your memory, Keith Pratt, our president, and myself, project manager. So today's agenda, I'll go through an update of what we've been doing since we last met in January. We're going to hopefully make some more progress on the water ordinance, which is where we kind of left off in the past, that and water rates, user rates. My slides today in these areas are going to be somewhat repetitive from our January meeting, but I think it's going to be helpful that way to refresh your memory on these important subjects, these two important subjects. And I'll bring you up to speed on the contract operations and timing, where we want to go from here and our next steps. So things that have been focused of some of our work efforts, first and foremost, congratulations, grant funding has been approved. On June 10th, the governor and council met to approve the recommendation of the Drinking Water and Groundwater Trust Fund Advisory Committee. The grant for the construction work has been approved. There is also funding from the MTBE settlement funds that have been secured or committed for the project. So right now, all construction funding is in place. As part of that, to get the funding approved, we went through some formal environmental review steps. The state issued what's known as a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact. This was done in phases because at the time we were presenting this, we still had some unresolved issues associated with two things. One is the East Road pump station, which I'll talk about in a bit. And the other was the growing number of MTBE sites that are contaminated and eligible for project construction funds. So we also have some other permitting activities in place or going on right now, and we'll need to do in the future. Most notably, wetlands permitting. That was submitted to the state for the water mains. There will be additional wetland permitting work associated with the pumping station on East Road. Some of you may be aware, I'm sure you're all aware actually, of the some of the issues that we face getting the site nailed down for the East Road pumping station. And the property that we had originally envisioned, the high ground that was just over the town line in Atkinson, is owned by two people or two groups, entities. One is a private owner, owns half of that upland area, and the other half was owned by the town of Atkinson. We were unable to secure an easement with the town of Atkinson. Back in January, actually, we advised the state in writing that the town was not cooperating with us to get an easement and that we wanted to move to a different solution. It was only a few weeks ago, really, that we got the green light to move ahead towards a new site that will involve more filling of wetlands, but it is all in Plaistow. And again, we're excited to move that along, but it has caused us some delay in the project, in this key component of the project. Design progress has gone well other than the East Road pump station, and we still have a significant amount of design work to do associated with the service connections. That number has grown from an original number of 56 properties. We're now up to 81. The DES has been conducting sampling efforts, and they have been put on hold due to the COVID-19 issues. But the sampling will continue, and the DES has reached out to every property owner that is abutting either the new lines that we are designing or the existing fire suppression system in town, offering those properties, excuse me, free testing of MTBE, and if they were to be found as contaminated, they would be entitled to a free hookup. That number of properties that we are now identifying as being connected has grown to 81. We've participated in regional meetings with the other communities involved in this large Southern New Hampshire regional water project. The other towns and the other projects have been going very well. To this date, there is now water that is being delivered from Manchester down through Derry, new pipelines that and pump station that bring it down to the Windham border, through Windham into Salem and to the Hampstead Area Water Company, who still has some work to do relative to getting their system completely converted. But they're all on track, and the regional meetings have been very helpful in coordinating that work, and glad to see that it is moving. So we're at the end of the line, and our project, of course, relies on these other projects to be completed successfully. A reminder, we have our design work divided into 4 contracts. Contract P1 for water mains. We're actually opening bids for this next week. So we're excited to see how that turns out. We have an estimate of just around $4 million for that work. And it includes water mains on East Road, actually starting at Bryant Woods Road and Atkinson on East Road to connect to the fire suppression system, Wentworth Avenue and Westville Road, and then up Sweet Hill Road to a new water tank. So those water mains should be under construction later this summer. And contract P2, a pumping station, as I said, we've now changed direction. We have moved the site to a property in Plaistow. Just today, we delivered to DeVos a site plan that will be presented to the planning board for their comment on July 15th, I believe. We still have a lot of design and permitting work to do associated with that change, and we'll get that out to bid as soon as we can, probably. P3, our Sweet Hill water tank, is under construction. It's exciting to actually have some start. A week or so ago, we have had our pre-construction meeting. The contractor has, and we expect that tank to be up by the end of this fall season. Service connections, as I mentioned before, that's contract P4. We envision that will be delayed in part because we won't have water until the pump station is done. But we expect that the service connection contract will be advertised sometime late winter, early spring for 2021 construction. So before I move on, any questions about where we are with some of these various pieces? If not, I'll go into the ordinance conversation.
Board, no? Jay? Do you have a question? Move his mic over.
Can you hear me? Gene, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So for the P1, I know we're putting out bids, but when are you anticipating to begin construction?
Well, we won't actually award the project until we get that wetland permit in hand. And that's the wild card. We actually have asked for a waiver, which would only take a couple of weeks to process. Just went in last week. But absent any permitting questions or delays, I would expect to be awarding the contract by late July, early August. So I would say by mid August, there should be, or hopefully there will be, a contractor out here laying pipe.
Okay, thank you.
And any other questions, board? All right, go ahead, Jean.
All right, so a little bit of a refresher on the water ordinance. I would preface this by saying that since our last meeting in January, we've had several efforts put into polishing this ordinance up. I want to thank John Radigan, who has provided some excellent review legally and suggestions that I think have improved the ordinance. We also just got back review comments from the State Department of Environmental Services, who also reviewed it, and their comments were very positive. They picked up a few typos and otherwise thought it was comprehensive and it had all the things that they would recommend. So I think that at this point, I'll go through it today, but I just want to stress that if there are any comments that come from the board or the public at that point, we can still make these changes. We welcome the input, and we would imagine a public hearing process to further polish it and make sure it's going to meet the needs of the town of Plaistow. So with that, just a reminder here as I go through it of some of the things we talked about, some of the issues that I think are worth going over again, just to remind ourselves of how critical they are and what it all means. And the three things here that I've shown on this screen are some of those key issues. The MSDC charge, capacity charge, this is a charge you'll recall that is from the Manchester Waterworks. They basically are providing or requiring these fees to be paid to buy capacity associated with their source development. That's the SD Manchester Source, Merrimack Source Development charges. This builds their water plant. This builds their capacity to deliver water, and this is a fee that is set forth in your regional agreement for the next several years. I'll go over those details of how you are entitled to purchase capacity that has been reserved and actually paid for by the state of New Hampshire at this point. We'll talk a little bit about the process for application for service, how that's done, what it all means. We'll talk about service area expansions. There was some comment back a while ago about wholesale versus retail rates. We think we've captured that in the way that we are incorporating different rates for different size meters, essentially larger meters getting a base charge that is reflective of their use. So the MSDC charge, the current rate right now is $3.79 per gallon of capacity. By Manchester Water Works regulations currently, it increases 3% every year. So it is expected to be $3.90 per gallon next year. There was an initial 100,000 gallons of capacity that has been purchased and reserved for the town of Plaistow. Now, this is the purpose of this is for the, as I said, 81 right now, but growing contaminated properties that are within the town. These, number of connections are unknown really at this time, but I can say that it is certainly projecting to be significantly less than the 100,000 gallons of capacity that you already have reserved for you. So that bonus, if you will, or that leftover becomes a policy issue for you to consider how you might want to utilize or reserve that remaining capacity. But first and foremost, keep in mind that this is there to pay for MTB contaminated sites. So under the regional agreement, there's a phase one available capacity of 250,000 gallons per day, 250,000 gallons. This needs to be, if you choose to purchase this, whoops, I just trying to do too many things here.
Question?
Gene, can you hear me? Gene?
Yes.
There's a question here. We've been trying to get your attention.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at my screen instead of the, yes. Go ahead.
Of the $100,000 capacity that we start out with, we've already increased the number of sites that have contamination. So that has cut into that. Will it be worthwhile to set that aside in case additional MTB sites show up later?
Yes, I would agree with that, thinking that some level should be reserved for at least the continuation and the conclusion of the work by the DES and their sampling. But you may also want to hold a little bit more in reserve for any that might crop up after that.
Yeah, for town properties, right? Yeah.
So, yeah, just speak up because I'm looking at the presentation myself, and when I do that, I lose the audience view. So if there's a question, just please shout out. As I said, the 250,000 gallon per day capacity is something that you have a right to purchase, but you need to exercise that right by May 1st, 2022. That depends on, the price for that will depend on when you do that, if you were to buy it. And after that date, it then becomes available to those other communities that might want additional capacity. So these numbers really came about because of the capacity that is either existing in the Manchester Waterworks system or as part of a new treatment plant that they're building. And that's where phase two comes in. Phase two flows.
Gene, can I interrupt you for a second? It looks like it says on the screen that if we purchase 150,000 gallons per day by the end of 2020, we get, in effect, a discount. So is that something that you would encourage us to do?
Well, yes, I think it's something I definitely encourage you to think about. The 3% increase is going to take place January 1st, 2021. And you know, you'd like to avoid that.
Right,
Keep in mind that, I mean, depending on how you set up your fee structure, you'll be charging the new users that want to hook up, and then basically turning that around and buying capacity. You can buy some in advance of those properties, that want to connect. But you know, if you have the funds, if you can acquire that early, that would be helpful. But of course, you still want to have the customers, and the customers ultimately pay for it. So it's a chicken and egg sort of thing. I would, at the very least, be very strongly aware of the May 1st deadline, so that you don't lose the right to buy it.
right.
But it depends. If you can get people to buy it in 2020, the problem is you still don't have a water system until 2021. It's not going to be functional in 2020.
All right,
That's a difference of
But if-
16,500 for that 150.
16,000?
16,500.
Okay, thank you, Julian.
Well, just a comment on the differential between the 379 now and what it increases. That increase will be passed on to the users, the new users that are trying to buy the allocation, so their startup charge would be increased. It's not a reflection of what the town would pay. It's a straight pass-through
right.
that they're doing. So
Right.
that increase will follow the users. So if a user signs up in 2021 and somebody else signs up in 2022 or later, they're going to pay the corresponding
Right.
pass-through charge for their allocation.
Right, right,
That's right. And I think that's a good way to look at it. You know, another way is you would be bankrolling it. You basically are banking it for those future users who are going to buy that capacity.
Well, would you consider that a potential incentive for people to jump on board even though we don't actually have potable water available and ready yet?
Absolutely, that would be an incentive. If I had a business, or if I was a homeowner,
Yeah.
I would want to be able to buy that capacity now
Okay.
before it went up 3%.
Okay,
But, you know, some may not see it that way because they may rather have their money in the bank where they're earning, not 3%
they're not earning
today.
3% in any bank that I'm
but not
aware of,
everything.
but, all right,
Certainly not in the stock market.
no,
But it would be advisable, I think, for people to buy it this year if they could.
all right, thank you.
And again, a similar thing will happen as phase 2 becomes available. Phase 2 flows are associated with the new treatment plant that Manchester is building. And again, you have an additional option here to purchase up to 320,000 gallons per day. Projecting out what that might cost in the future, you know, that could be in the range of another $1.2 million. But as Mark pointed out, these are fees that are passed on to the new customers because they're the ones buying capacity. And just a reminder, I don't see any threat to this, but I will say that the agreement, the regional agreement does stipulate that Plaistow will be required to buy at least a minimum flow, or use at least a minimum flow of 40,000 gallons per day by June 2025. And, you know, we've already touched on some of these capacity charge policy questions. What do you do with the first 100,000 gallons? You know, you reserve it for the impacted properties. You recognize that there's still more to come. How will capacity be allocated is another question. Is it all first come, first serve, or do you put caps on it? Do you consider land use restrictions? You save some for your own public uses. Do you look at growth centers? And, you know, these are factors that you may want to further explore with your planning department as you develop a master plan for the town. Should there be a cap for a single user? And how should the capacity be estimated and charged? I think we've answered these questions, and Keith will get into some of this in terms of the fees. But again, the meter sizing is something that we do recommend.
Okay.
So what we have to date, or what we had in January, we have not updated these numbers to the new 81, but these were the numbers estimated back in January. Things are growing, but we don't have a final number, so we haven't redone this. But we're looking at an estimated flow of just the free hookups, if you will, of about 25,000 gallons per day. But there will be expectations for expansions of the service area, of the number of customers. And just to talk about a few that were identified earlier this year: Timberlane High School, Pollard Elementary. There's a Southview building that's got 26 apartments. Greenfield Hills, Twin Ridge, Pennachuck Water Systems are interested, which, without really too much effort, brings us very close to another 60,000 gallons of capacity from interested parties. So I think the growth is real and likely, and we expect that there'll be houses here and there that will also want to connect once it becomes available.
Jean, I have a question for you regarding that last
Yep.
screen. Do you have a drop dead date for when these properties need to make a formal commitment to you or to us as to whether they're going to jump on board with this?
No, I don't. This is something that could be years out, or
All
they could be, waiting right in line when the water system gets turned on. It's really up to them. I think within the ordinance and some of the incentives that we just talked about, and limits that we talked about, things like the increasing the MSDC charge, those kind of incentives might have these potential customers lined up a bit quicker. They don't want to see those increases.
Okay, Julian has a question for you also.
I'm looking at the numbers you have presented so far. Am I wrong that it looks like we already have 85,000 gallons per day possible usage already allocated just by the line items that you showed along with the MTBE sites?
Yeah, I think those are, but again, I would say the bulk of them, these on this list here, for example, are very tentative. I don't know how quickly and readily Timberlane High School might be able to move forward. They would require just about $1 million water main to be extended out to reach them. Some of these other ones may be not that quick, and there may be others that are very, very ready. We've heard also from the new medical building that they want to connect, and there are others that have been providing interest. But I think it's very real, and maybe not 80,000, but I think that they'll be up there.
What that tells me is we're near that 100,000 already, and then you have some commercial or whatever decides to turn on their water sprinklers to roll their lawn, to water their lawns, because there's no restriction on that, as far as I'm aware of. And then we'd hit that 100,000 capacity quite easily if that should happen, especially in a drought condition.
Yeah, one of the things I should point out with regard to the MSDC charge is that it's not a peak day or a peak week or even a peak month. It is, I forget exactly how it's balanced out, but it is something that's averaged over time. And
Gene, I think it's a 3-month. I think it's a 3-month rolling average.
Yeah, that sounds right. I just wasn't 100% sure. And I again would keep in mind that this list here, these are the ones that are getting in for free.
Yeah.
The ones that are expansions, they're going to be paying I would assume,
That's right.
for that capacity. So your 100,000 gallons is what you have received from the state for free. There's still 150,000 gallons to meet the needs of these customers who would come onto the system. So I wouldn't worry too much about hitting that that peak.
All right. Okay. Jay has a question for you, Jean.
Hey, Gene,
Yes, sir.
for the schools, you came up with an average GPD. What is the formula for that? And is that different than, say, a typical residential household?
These numbers come from different sources relative to the Timberland High School. This is actually based on water use records from the school.
Okay.
So Gene, can you speak for a minute on equivalent users? Because I don't think anywhere in here we have that breakdown, but if we were to convert all these, we would come up with equivalent users.
Yes, correct. There are a number of ways and a number of different numbers that are sometimes used. But one way we try to get to a common way of thinking is by, equivalent user approach. This approach is seen, for example, in counting the units in the Southview building or in the Greenfield Hills homes, the Sweet Hill numbers, for example. So it's often a difficult thing and inconsistent things are said about it, because sometimes we talk about an equivalent user for a apartment being different than, say, for a 4-bedroom house for a service connection. But I think it's helpful to have that. We've often early on been talking about trying to get to a 400 service connection kind of number. And the way you get there is using equivalent users.
Gene,
Yes.
the MTB number 61, I thought they had grown
82.
to 82. So that represents more than what you have on your chart. Another
That's
third
correct.
more.
I've not updated the chart here. I'm sorry, but we just haven't done any analysis on those yet. As you can see, the analysis of this 61 shows a distribution between single-family homes, residential apartments and condos, small commercial, large commercial. All of these have different estimates per use. And so we haven't done this analysis yet. We had been waiting to submit a design amendment to capture these additional units. And we were hoping originally that we would have a final count this past winter, at the end of the winter. But now we're in a holding pattern. We'll probably be doing this in the summer and fall of this year. And we'll have a better understanding of just which properties, what kinds of properties are the ones that we're finding contaminated. Some may be in industry, some may be commercial. We just don't know the distribution yet. So I have no data to modify this to bring it up to the 82.
So I just want to clarify that. So if there is another 20 users to 81, that 25,000 would change to approximately 30,000. So it's not substantial, but it would go up a little bit.
It would take more of the 100,000 that Julian mentioned.
Which would mean that there's 70,000 available.
Right.
And to an earlier point that Gene talked about reserving capacity in town-owned buildings,
Yeah.
there are town-owned buildings that have MTBE. So I don't know, Gene, if those town buildings are part of this, of the original number, though.
Doesn't look like.
No, they are not. No, they're not in here
So
at
that
all.
would increase by, say, 3 or 4?
Most likely, yes.
I have a question. It's like something like the Pollard School or the Timberlane, are they going to be excluded from that extra charge for hookup? The
That
charge?
is a decision you can make, but we haven't done that yet.
So the more specific answer to your question is that 70,000 gallons that has already been paid for, the delta, is a board decision, a policy decision a board would make on not only Timberlane, but anybody else that you wanted to incentivize to connect up on that first remaining 70,000, if that's what the remainder is, to incentivize on the front end. So that has been explained to the school. For instance, I explained it to them myself, and my purpose for doing that is because they would have to bond a article, and they would have to put in approximately a mile of pipe, which is around $1 million. And the incentive I told them is that perhaps if the board, if you were within that time frame and there was still capacity available, then the board could allow you to tap into that without paying for the allocation. So I've already communicated to them the possible incentive if they wanted to get in front of this. But it is a board decision on who you want to reserve that capacity for.
And I think when we all vote to approve policy decisions, obviously, it's going to have to be a tiered approach where we do priorities first and then we work our way down. But I think that's a case for, establishing policies down the road. And I'm guessing or hoping that we can make some inroads in that at our July meeting. And we'll
Yeah.
see. Yeah.
My question, kind of leaning toward, let's say we're getting toward that 100,000 and you incentivize or whatever, but getting to that limit, then all of a sudden you got to come up with that amount to pay for that upfront next of tier of allocation. Where does that money come from?
Comes from the users that are asking for allocation. That's part of their purchase to opt into the program. So say you're past the allocation of 100, that's already that's already gone. So there is no more incentives or prepaid. And a house wants to connect up. There will be a charge for that house for them to buy the allocation based on their consumption usage. So they have to pay that amount
But
to
we
the
have-
town, and then the town pays it to Manchester.
Oh, we don't have to buy the whole block?
No,
though?
we can buy it in increments. That was in the handout that we gave, is that you could
Okay.
buy it in increments.
So we don't have to upfront of it in any
No.
shape
No,
or
that-
fashion? Okay.
That was in the water ordinance about buying that.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure about that.
Yeah.
was all.
Okay, Jean, I guess we're all set. Go ahead.
Yep. All right, great. I'll move along now to application for service. These are just some administrative things, but I just wanted to point out that, and this kind of segues into where Keith's going to take over to talk about rates. The application for service is covered in the water ordinance and talks to issues of standards for construction as well, how they're inspected. This is an administrative role, but it's very important to understand how a new user can hook up. So I just wanted to draw your attention to those aspects of the ordinance as something to take a look at. With this, I'm going to turn it over to Keith. And Keith, do you have the PowerPoint handy, or do I need to scroll through it?
I'll just tell you to hit next slide.
All right.
That'll be the easiest thing. Good evening, everybody. Yeah, and Gene's asked me to refresh on where we left off on the rates when we met with you last time in January. And so I've had him keep in the key slides from that meeting. And they're going to cover really three parts to the rate structure that we were recommending at that time. Two of them were one-time fees. First one being fees to cover the install or the application of service. It's maybe administration, the actual inspection of the line as it's connected to the property, those kinds of things. The second one was one we were suggesting to be considered was a system development charge, which would also be a one-time charge. And if you recall, the discussion there was a proposal so that in addition to covering your costs for fees that there is an equity issue as new users come on because of the equity that the existing users have invested in the existing system. This SDC is designed for new users to bring themselves up to an equal equity position. And we'll show you what that is. We broke it up into both a domestic or a residential charge and a commercial charge. And then the one that we're all most interested in, I think, or is the one that's going to be on a monthly or quarterly charge basis, which is quarterly here in Plaistow, would be the meter charge and the actual consumption. Next slide. The system development charge we proposed or suggested could be implemented was this, and it was established to be a domestic charge for a 3/4 inch connection at about $550 to cover the MSDC, as Mark was just talking about. That's essentially what it would be, plus the assets you have in Plaistow, which is the existing transmission lane, 11 miles of existing transmission main. So it would be about $1,500 as an SDC charge. Now, of course, the MTBE impacted properties are getting that waived or covered by the DES. And then for fire suppression, we had recommended these. So a commercial facility with 35,000 square feet or less that wants fire suppression sprinklers would be $2,500. And if they had hydrants in their parking lot, they could be assessed at $500 as well. So without going into the details, it's a very common charge that water systems use, but that was the one we presented for consideration. Okay, next slide.
Could I just ask a question about the 1 inch and greater has $3.69 and $7.02. Could you flesh that out a little bit and tell us exactly what that is?
Yes, and the reason we do it that way is because 90% of the connections you're probably going to be making are going to be residential or based on a 3/4 inch meter. So there's a standard fee to that. As you get into the larger meter sizes, there is usually a discussion on what they need and how they want to use that. So it's a 1 or 2 or 3 inch meter is normally based on some sort of a calculation on what their uses are. So it's harder to establish a fixed fee for those. So we just say it's going to be based on a per gallon basis. If they want a 2 inch meter and they're going to use 300 gallons a day, then we would be basing it on that.
Okay.
And so there would be more of a negotiated thing, and that's also fairly common as well.
So those are gallons per day then, correct?
Yeah, that would be based on a gallons per day.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
And the 3/4 inch one is as well, but it's based, we just assume that a residential typically uses 150. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
If this is an important slide, you've seen it before. It's our estimate as to what the operational budget would be for the water system at various wholesale purchases per day. So on the bottom x-axis there, you see 20,000 on the left and you see 80,000 on the right. That's the amount of water purchased through the wholesale agreement as it's wheeled from Manchester. So on the left-hand side, if we had started up the system with only 20,000 gallons per day, we estimate you could afford a budget of 200,000, which is on the y-axis here. As you get more users and you're consuming more water, the budgets can increase to the point where we've estimated at 80,000 gallons a day of wholesale water purchase, you could afford a budget at $420,000 a year. Once you subtract out the actual wholesale purchases, it tells you that operational costs or operational expenses to operate this system should range from a low of a 160 when we're in the low range of 20,000 to 280,000. So as we enter into contracts with an operator and we tabulate the costs associated with the town running these systems from administrative and other things, those are the ranges of costs we're talking about. And so we're really, and you heard 60,000 gallons a day or 400 equivalent users Gene mentioned earlier. When we look at a typical residential using 150 gallons per day, if you multiply 150 times 400 connections or users, equivalent users, you get 60,000 gallons a day. So that's been kind of our target as to what we would like to be in to get you guys started. just because it establishes what we think is a more appropriate revenue. Next slide. So the reason those budgets are important is because they're really based on a rate that we think is reasonable as a starting point here. And if you remember, we targeted a rate of $630 per residential home in Plaistow per year. And that's equivalent to the midpoint of this blue box. So a residential unit using the rates that we're suggesting, using 150 gallons a day, every day for 365 days, would be paying $630 a year. The green line represents what the Plaistow typical residential user would use. If you slide off to the left-hand side of this chart, they would be paying less. All the way down, if you use 2,000 gallons per month, which is equivalent to what, a third of 150 gallons a day, you'd be down in the $400 range. And if you used 8,000 gallons a month, it would be above 800 and 900. And so what this chart did is it put the Plaistow rates, most importantly, put the Plaistow rates consistent with the neighbors or just slightly below, if you remember that discussion, and that's how we targeted it. And so the other rate structures are shown here. Rolling Hills on the top yellow, which is a Panachuk system, I believe. And then you got Hawk in light blue, which would be just above what we're projecting Plaistow rates to be. And then you got Hudson and Salem, which are below what we're projecting Plaistow rates to be.
All right, Keith, I have a question for you. In our book that you so kindly gave us, it talks about median household incomes. Did you base these suggested rates on the median household incomes, or how did you arrive at that little sweet spot?
The sweet spot was arrived at saying, targeting what we thought was a reasonable rate to sort of match up with what your neighbors are. So the $630 at that 150 gallons a day is just under what your neighbors are. And so that's where we started. And I think I don't have that MHA in front of me, but I'm guessing it's in the 70,000 range maybe in Plaistow.
Yeah,
Do you have it?
our median income, yeah, very good. Our median household income, I looked it up today, it's about $70,286.
Yeah, and so we did look at that, and what we do try to target is that a water rate is less than 1% of the MHI for a community is usually a typical target.
Okay. All right, so we're right on board with that too. Okay.
You're right under the 1% target numbers.
Okay, good.
Okay. If no other questions on that one, the next slide. So those rate structures are based on this rate chart. So if you have a 3/4 inch meter, we have a quarterly charge of $63 a quarter. Multiply that times 4 to get your annual meter charge. And then based on what you consume, you would get charged $5.24 per 100 cubic feet. So that's how we calculate the bill. So anybody from this chart could calculate what their bill would be if they knew what their consumption was. But that chart, the table before that would actually does that work for you too.
Keith, there was also mention made about base rates plus user fees. Is the meter cost part of the base rate? Because I guess I wasn't really clear on that when I was reading.
Base might be terminology here, but if we have, so if I'm going to, and installation fees, the cost of install would be mine. And then I'd have an application fee. Those fees would be one time, but these quarterly charges are oftentimes referred to as the base charge. So if that's what you're thinking about, then yes.
Okay. So we're paying for these meters.
But I'm not exactly sure what you're looking at. Yeah.
Okay. So we're basically paying for the meters kind of in perpetuity. Basically, we're not actually purchasing them and not winding up paying for them. We're just basically renting them and for future, obviously, repair and maintenance.
So when you say we, are you talking about a homeowner?
We the town, the
No,
homeowners.
the town
The
would be-
homeowners.
Okay, so let me just break it down. The town would buy the meters
Right,
at a fixed cost.
Right.
We would own, the town, as the we, would own the meters.
okay,
And then, in turn, we would be renting them to the owners with a quarterly charge.
okay. But
And
in
so,
perpetuity, basically,
well,
right?
yes, into
Okay.
perpetuity for so long as they have water, water meters in their house.
All right.
So what that does is that does provide a source of revenue for the town for the maintenance and the operation and the replacement of meters into perpetuity, so we don't have to revisit this again.
Okay, all right.
And I do want to make a point, though, that to finish the answer on that question, in the upfront fees, when I apply for service, we have suggested that a homeowner would be paid, there's a connection fee. It's $1,300 is what we're proposing. And so that covers the cost of the initial meter, and then you're paying the rents on it in perpetuity. Okay?
Yep, thank you.
And if it was a larger meter, it would be a higher charge, so that the town would purchase them, but basically the user who's getting the connection would be covering that cost in the connection fee. Okay.
Keith, can I make one more comment, and you can explain it? Because I
Yep.
don't think this chart
Yep.
that I'm about to talk about is in this presentation. There was a kind of a matrix chart in the January meeting that showed what other communities are charging for the rental of the meters and the connection charges, and it showed that you put this together with what other places are charging, and we were somewhat in the middle of that range, probably closer to the bottom and not to the top on that. But I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yes, and I think you were given, I'm hoping you were given these charts. I'm not going to do this, but they looked like they were in blue. And all these charges that I'm talking about are all in there, including the connection charge that you should have received. That was dated January 27th. And what Mark is talking about is a benchmarking evaluation we did for all your neighbors and similar systems to establish what their connection fees were. So that we essentially, for a starting point in Plaistow, just said we're going to fall in the middle and sort of take what we see as a typical rate. So you're not higher than others, you're not lower than others. We started you out as what would be a typical charge based on our experience and based on what your neighbors are doing. But you should have that list of rates in the January 27 handout. It was blue, it was 2 pages, landscape, and it had a date of January 27th on it. And it looked like that. And there was a second page to it. This clip on the PowerPoint is the first part of it. Although that one says January 14th, I think it was probably updated January 27th, but that is a 2-page document. Okay, next slide. This is just another representation of the chart that I showed you earlier, representing that $200,000 budget for a 20,000 gallon a day wholesale purchase, up to the range of 420,000 gallons, $420,000 of expenses could be supported from an 80,000 gallons a day wholesale purchase. And this was the range of operations that I mentioned earlier, between 160 and 280,000. Okay. There's a little footnote on the bottom of here that says the revenue based on selling 90% of the wholesale water purchased. What that means is your operators will occasionally flush lines through the hydrants to keep, that's part of normal maintenance. There's although Plaistow, we believe, has a fairly tight system with not much leaks, if any, but we do assume that there will be a little bit of leakage, so that you're actually buying the water for these flushing operations and the leaks, but you're not selling it. So we account for a 10%, we accounted for a 10% wholesale purchase, and then you're really only selling 90% of what you bought. So there's a little bit of a buffer there for you.
Keith,
Okay.
could I just ask you a quick
Yeah.
question about the contingency aspect of this? I don't know if this is the right time to do this, but is this something that can accumulate over time, or is it something that has to be returned back to a general fund like we do with our budget?
No. In my understanding, in an enterprise fund and a user-based budget, that it can continue
All
on.
right, good, okay, good to know.
There's probably other people in the room could correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding.
Okay.
Okay, next slide. So we're using these target rates for planning. I think it's the best based on, as long as we can fit our operational costs within those. I think it's a good starting point. We do know that so we can set them probably as soon as practical or as soon as possible. But we do know that it can be modified at any time. I mean, you have the rights. If we're just short, we can adjust the rate slightly. If we overshot on the revenues, you could adjust rates accordingly, or we could then just start funding a capital reserve or do some other things. So we figured we had, as you remember, the challenge in Plaistow is we didn't have real costs. Whenever we do rate work, and we do it all over the state, we know we have a history of costs, and we have a projection of capital programs. So it's easier to set rates. Here, we don't know what the operational costs are going to be yet. We have a pretty good idea, but until we get in there, we don't know for sure. So you got to remember, these are targets. And we really won't know what the operational budgets will be until we get a contract operator on board.
Keith, can I jump in for a second?
Yeah.
So it's customary in other towns that have water enterprise systems for them to receive a financial analysis from the finance department or the town manager annually to show what the current rate is and what some of the operational costs or capital costs are, and then adjust that rate. They could lower it, they could keep it the same, or they could increase it. And that's customary to revisit it every year, and you take into account what's happened in the last year. And sometimes you'll actually do a financial analysis of where you need to be in 2 or 3 years for your capital planning, and you'll adjust your rate accordingly. But that's, as I know you're new for water commissioners, that's how it's done in other municipalities.
So
It's
that-
reviewed annually.
That was actually my next question. Is Greg Colby going to be involved in putting together this
He
budget
already
for us?
is.
All right.
He could be watching this, on the internet right now with the live stream. But yes, that's his duty, and that's what he will do. It's an enterprise fund, and you can do that with any enterprise fund, is to review it once a year to make sure you know exactly where you're at.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I think somewhere in this planning is it considered, because in reality, sometimes you're gonna have to replace a line or something, and you gotta pay for that. And the other thing is, in reality, you're gonna expand this in the future to include another street or another road, which is quite expensive. So you have to accumulate those funds out of your current revenue, so to speak, so that you can expand it in the future for future users.
So my comment to that is that's another definition of a CIP. So you'd have a CIP for the water to know what it is that you're planning to do, and then you would be accounting for those funds to do that next step. If you knew 2 years down the road you wanted to expand it, you would have a CIP, it would be there, and you would know what you needed to do, and you'd have a financial analysis to show how to get there.
But the CIP would have to come out of what you're receiving for water rates.
It would,
You don't want to take it out of
well,
the regular taxpayers who don't use water.
it's not going to come out, well, let me just say this. Municipalities can assess to the regular taxpayers some of the benefits of a water system, for instance, the fire protection. But that's a policy decision that the board makes. If they were to allocate, for instance, I know communities sometimes on the expansion will allocate, 80% towards the water fund and 20% for the non-water users, because there's a collateral benefit of the system for fire protection for the town and so forth. But, so it's a policy decision. But if we were to assume that there was a project that was going to come up 2 years from now, and we were already established, and you knew that you needed X amount of dollars, you can look at the capital reserve fund, or you could look at a bonding. You could look at an article that would be bonded by the whole town, and if it was passed, then it would be paid for by the water users. So there's a lot of options that would happen with expansion, but tonight's purpose is not talking about expansion per se. It's about focusing on the establishment of a water ordinance, so that next meeting we can have a public hearing to establish the water ordinance and the rate. That's a subsequent discussion, and probably be 20 of those discussions about expansion.
Okay, and I'm guessing also that if we include depreciation expenses in that will also help to offset things as well. So there's, I think, multiple ways that we can approach replacing costs on the road. Okay.
And I'll add just one of the take-home things here, messages, that's the word I was looking for, take-home messages, is that we do not see the ability to probably start contributing to a capital reserve fund, or even depreciation in that case, probably until you get to about that 60,000 gallons a day use, just because you're starting up and we're trying to maintain a reasonable rate. So as you are smaller, you're not going to have that flexibility. So in our planning and the work we did, it was around that 60,000 gallons a day where we saw you could start contributing. And obviously, the bigger you get, I think the easier it will be to start funding a capital reserves. So, or contingencies or depreciation. So I just wanted to point that out just because of the unique circumstances here. The last bullet I said, yep.
Is there any other water usages? I mean, we haven't talked about like fire suppression, which I assume is going to be a very, very small volume. But is there any other things? You talked a little bit about flushing out. Is there anything else that has a substantial use of water when we have a system that's up and running?
It's typically going to be the flushing and fire protection is going to be where or leaks. Those are probably the three big ones. And I think for most systems and that don't have a treatment plant, because there are some processed waters and somebody who has a treatment plant that would actually not be sold either. But for you, I think it's fire protection, system maintenance from flushing, and leaks. And I think the leaks are minor as far as we know. And the others are usually pretty well managed and do not necessarily, because when we flush the system, we do it twice a year, and it's not a lot of water and it doesn't happen very frequently. So I think I think 10% is not a bad estimate for you guys.
Okay, Julian has a question for you
Yeah,
also.
so have we figured yet, because currently our use of the fire suppression system, we charge a certain fee to businesses for fire suppression, but the water we're using right now, we're getting from the ground, the dirty water, so to speak. Now we're going to be using potable water. Have we figured out what the additional costs or change to their fee structure will be, so if they have a fire, that the water will be essentially paid for?
Keith, you want to take that?
And that's probably going to, and it's a good question. Right now, we were looking at maintaining the revenues and the revenue structure that you had on the fire protection charges, but it is something that we do need to look at. My guess is, because you don't consume a lot of water in town right now, you keep your pressures sustained and the pipes full, but it's very rarely, other than maybe practicing or even flushing maybe now, that there's a lot of water actually consumed. So our guess is that you're covering those expenses, but it is something we have to look at. Right now, what's going to happen is they're going to be charged for all their domestic uses where they weren't before because they had private wells. But it is something we have to look at closer, Julian, as we continue on operating the system.
Because if you have a commercial building go down, that's going to be a lot of gallons of water for that type of a fire, so.
Well,
yeah.
Just want to jump in. So a static system, one that's charged now with either, it's dry or it has water in it. We'll call that pond water because that's what it is right now. So the pond water is going to be replaced when this system goes online with drinking water. But then that water in that charged system is going to be stagnant again. So there's not going to be a recurring charge on that, but for a sprinkler head going off and it discharging. In a lot of your larger commercial fires, and perhaps even with some residential, you can make a claim to the insurance company for the water usage. So that is done where it can be done, and you can charge for the use of the water. We had a particularly big fire over in Salem, and they used 1 million gallons of water, and so they did charge the insurance company for the additional water. So we're not talking about if somebody uses 500 gallons to put out a fire or even 2,000 gallons to put out a fire. We're talking about some kind of major incident that should not be put on the backs of the water users, the enterprise fund.
Right, so there is a recovery.
Yeah,
Right.
and just to keep it in perspective, Mark used the 1 million gallon a day usage in that fire. That would probably cost you $7,000 with the rates that you're getting charged. So if you had one fire a year, which I don't know that you have, but that's the range you'd be talking about. Okay, the last bullet I had on here was incentives, and there was some discussion of that earlier. I'll show you, remind you what we were looking at last time. So Gene, we can go to the next slide. And we were, I think as we're looking at this, you can buy more water from the MSDC in increments, and you need users, and the more users, the better to operate this system. So I think there's an incentive to get people connected, and there's going to be some business cases for that. And so I think you would want to know that if you're bumping up against the 100,000 gallons, that you have to plan and adjust accordingly and buy more. But I also think you want to be in the business of getting as many connections as you can as quickly as possible. Here's one way to do that. And on the columns are all the various costs, the upfront costs that we talk about. These are not the consumption rates or the quarterly rates and the meter charges. These are just the one-time fees to enter the system. We have the install cost, which is actually the physical cost of laying the pipes and the connections on the property. We have the MSDC, which we talked about. That's the purchase price for the water from Manchester. We have the SDC in Plaistow. That was the equal equity position we talked about. And then we have the connection fees and administration fees. And so on the rows, we had the various users or a couple thresholds. For the MTBE properties, we all know they're getting everything either waived or paid for by DES, so they're covered. We suggested in January the next 40,000 could be a good threshold for incentives, and you add the 40 to the 25 or 30 that we've been talking about, gets you to the 70, and that's the number Mark was using earlier. And so for the install cost, there's no incentive. That's just a contractors to come in and do the work. But we could waive the MSDC because we got that covered by the MTBE funds, so that could be waived. The SDC, we may want to look at some incentives if you want to connect up early, maybe 50% reduction for residentials, maybe 25% for commercials. Similarly for the connection fees, and maybe because the administration service fees are kind of you need to cover some expenses, maybe that doesn't need to be an incentive there. And then after we use the next 40,000, we can drop the incentives. And this would be our way of saying, hey, first you come in early, you get an incentive. And maybe we put a time frame on it too. Maybe we allow this to happen for the first 40,000 or the first year, whatever comes first. And then the other one we looked at was your municipal connections. I heard you talk about that. True, too. Certainly doesn't necessarily make sense to charge yourself an MSDC and just sort of have a revolving money there, but that would be another way to get those connected. So this was our thoughts at a first approach to some incentives to get connections. And I don't think that was the end of my part.
Okay, excuse me, Julian has a question, sorry.
I'm sorry to go back, it's almost like a previous question, and I know what the answer to Mark says, that the water connection fee, and we charge, I'm looking at the ordinance, and say 10 users come on, we charge them the connection fee, and we go over the 100,000, it looks like we have to buy it by 100,000 or something. That doesn't come to $500,000 to increment ourselves up to the next level.
We have 5 years to do it. Don't we have like 5 years to do this by 2025?
I'll just use this example. Once we hit the 100,000 that's already paid for, and there's more users that want to come on, they have to pay the going rate for the MSDC charge. And it can be bought in any increments. So if you had 10 houses a month and they collect those 10 connection MSDC charges, then you just call up Manchester and buy enough of
Oh,
that
so you
charges.
could buy it by 10,000 or whatever. Okay.
10 houses, 10,000, 20,000.
That was
You're
my question.
activating the full amount in terms of your right to purchase.
You're activating increment amounts within the scope of what you're allowed to purchase.
Right.
Okay.
But what I'm saying is, once we decide to do that,
Yeah.
we can continue to increase our usage from that same amount.
Absolutely. So really, another way to say it is we're not forced to buy a large block ahead of time and then wait for people to connect. We can buy it as we need it, or as the houses can give us the money to buy the allocation, we pass it on to Manchester.
Kind of like reserving that block of water.
Correct.
If we don't
Yeah.
use
Right.
it, we're reserving it, nobody
Correct.
else can get to that water.
Correct.
And we have
But there's an
benchmarks.
expiration on it.
Right.
Because
benchmarks,
other
right.
people that precede us, because we're at the end of the system, if we don't exercise our option by a date certain,
Mm-hmm.
anybody else in front of us in the system can buy
that
that
water.
allocation for their use.
Right.
That's right.
Got it.
So there's an example of buying allocations ahead of time because you don't want to lose that. I would say that that discussion would be more date sensitive, that when you're bumping up against that allocation of a deadline, that you have a drop dead date to purchase the allocation, then I could see us sitting here and you making a decision. Do we buy that allocation, even though we don't have a user for it right now? Do we buy it so we don't lose it? So that we reserve it so that we can resell it to the people that are going to come on afterwards?
So when we get close to that May 1st benchmark, that's when we need to make that decision as to
Yes.
whether to purchase.
Correct.
Whatever we're allowed to purchase up to
Correct.
that
Yeah,
point.
and we
So,
hold it
yeah.
at the current rate, too.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Right.
I think we're good on this. Go ahead, Jay, sorry.
So as far as the installation cost goes, is there options for incentivizing that as opposed to incentivizing the connection fees? Because would it be more enticing to people to incentivize that as opposed to the connection fee? Because it's going to be a little more expensive than the connection fee.
Yeah, and Gene, do you have, I know in our bullpen slides, did we have a graphic showing the service connection from the transmission main to the property?
I think so.
Maybe while I'm answering that, just because I want to make sure people understand what we're meaning when we say the install cost versus these other fees. And I know at one time we did have that graphic, I can tell you.
Give me a second, I can try to find it.
Yeah, I don't see it on there. But I can explain it, and what we talk about in the install fees is when we do the transmission main work as part of P1, and Gene, tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe we're bringing all the water service from the transmission main to the properties that want connections, so we'll get them over there. The install cost we're talking about is from the property line to the back of the house and reconnect it in the basement to replace their well. And that's on the private property, and that's the install cost that's really theirs. I don't know that you're in a position outside of the MTBE properties who are getting that paid for by the state. I don't think you're in the position that you'd want to incentivize that. It's a little trickier because you're off on private property.
But I think in covering that, we did talk previously about that we could, instead of having to come up front and pay $2,000 or something, depending on their length of lines or whatever, that we could work it into their bill over a long period of time so they don't have to come up with that money up front.
Yes, that's right. No, that's a good point. We did talk about that. And so let's say maybe the town is willing, if you're in the first year, we would offer a 5-year interest-free loan or something that could be surcharge, or it could be a surcharge on their bill. That's right. Those are things we can look at too.
Yeah, and I will add that there was some discussion even with, at the state level about the concepts whereby if the town wanted to, they conceivably could take out a state revolving loan fund from the state's program that basically is a low interest loan for municipalities and for water systems. And you could serve as a manager, if you will, of individual connection customers, if you want. Many homeowners, for example, do not have the wherewithal or knowledge to manage a project like bringing a water main into their house. And it's conceivable that a town could do that for them, take a loan out, and that could be added to their bill and paid over time, a lien perhaps on the property. But there are ways that could be done. I think that it would be challenging to set it up, but it is conceivable, and we've have talked to the state about that potential.
Yeah, and Thanks for the reminder, but I think maybe I had given the example of Rochester because we're doing a similar project in Rochester. It's not water, it's sewer, but the city of Rochester chooses to bid all that private work as part of their municipal contract, and then the homeowners can sign up for a 5-year interest-free loan, but they have to use the city's contractor in that case. They're not obligated to use him, but if they do, then they can get the 5-year interest-free loan. If they don't want to use the city's contractor, they don't get the benefit. What the city gets out of it is they get to control the work. They know it's done with the standard that they expect. And then the homeowner gets presumably a better bid because it's based on a larger pool or a larger quantity, and then they get a 5-year interest-free loan. So yeah, those are things that can be done. As Gene said, the state's okay with it too.
And just, again, to refresh the point of schedule, P4, where we're going to be doing quite a number of service connections, is expected to be advertised late winter, early spring. There's time if you wanted to pursue factoring in this kind of opportunity for your citizens, your businesses and homeowners. We could do that, but now's the time to think about it, make a decision if you wanted to.
So to recap the end of this meeting, I'm going to suggest that we plan on scheduling another meeting on July 20th, which is in between our board meetings, for a public hearing. And at that point, we will be making formal decisions on rates and ordinances, et cetera, et cetera. Is that agreeable to the board and to you, gentlemen?
Well, whatever you choose to do is certainly acceptable to us. I would encourage the process to try to move forward so that we get to adoption of rates and of course the ordinance. I think the ordinance comes first, or at least concurrent with rates.
Yeah.
I think that the process of having a public hearing and the formal nature of what needs to be done to adopt it is really the purview of your attorney, but I would certainly encourage and be happy to be there on the 20th to help move that along.
Okay. And Attorney Radigan, is that appropriate?
I think the ordinance is in largely the final form, and so all you need to do is conduct a public hearing. After taking public comment, if there is any public comment, close the hearing and then make a motion to adopt the ordinance.
Okay, and I've read 4 other towns' ordinances, and these are pretty much verbatim from everybody else's. So I don't know if you've all had a chance to read them or not, but they're pretty boilerplate, and so I'm not anticipating any issues with that. But if you're all agreeable to that time and that amount of work, then maybe we can schedule that meeting for July 20th and make sure we move this
forward.
forward.
Just do the public hearing
Yes.
aspect of it,
Yeah, and-
newspaper notice.
Yep, Beth will take care of all that because she's wonderful and she always does that for us. Okay, go ahead,
And
Julie.
I'm getting from Eugene this thing about having the ability for people to not have to pay up front to do the actual install cost, not the SDC or MDC, but the install cost. Sounds like we have to do this kind of a little ahead of time because we have to get approvals for the rotating fund or whatever.
So we'd have to apply for the revolving fund, the state revolving fund, and we would have to articulate, it's like a grant, and we'd have to articulate what the purpose is. We'd have to compete, and then we would have to balance that financially to figure out what the how that cost would be passed on to the customer over what time frame, and that would parallel the loan. Certainly not to make money, but it's to pass the cost along. It's making you're financing. The town would be financing a loan, a huge loan, so that they could break it up into pieces for the individual homeowners that wanted to finance this on their water bill, and it would go with the deed of their house. So it wouldn't be that the homeowner now could sign on to this deal and then sell the house and walk away, because it does get, it does follow the deed of the house. Attorney Radigan can
But it
speak to
would,
that.
say sell a house, it would get paid off.
It would continue to get paid by whoever owns the property.
But The reason
If
I'm
I-
asking
if I could
out
also
is,
interject-
we don't want to wait till the last minute to do this, because I think it would incentivize people to know they don't have to come up with $5,000 up front to make the connection. That's a big disabler in their decision. Where am I gonna get the money in these times to suddenly, I want to get the water, but I'm gonna come up with $5,000. It's just not gonna happen. But if you say, well, if we already have this set up so that we can do this, and we've planned it ahead of time, because I don't know what the time we'd have to start to do this, so that by the time we're getting connections,
So
it's ready.
Gene has some answers on this, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah, if I could just interject, a couple points. First, I would say that this is a separate thing from the ordinance, so I wouldn't want to see this
Okay.
subject delay adoption of the ordinance or rates. Very separate. Having said that, I also think that if you choose to use the state revolving loan program, and probably regardless of how you bond this, I would envision the town would be basically bonding some amount to bankroll these properties, connections. And that would require a town vote, which I think you would hold at your town meeting in March. So, the urgency, we should be starting to think about it, developing plans if you want to do this. But keep in mind that I think the final bonding authority shouldn't be forgotten about. That's going to be, I think, a town vote, unless you have some other ideas.
But I
I'm not
think
aware of how.
So that gives
But
us
the
a little
bonding
time.
is
Yeah,
not to the town's monies, it's to the the water funds. It's bounded to the water fund, not to, well, it is the town, but it's not the general fund town.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
When you write the warrant article,
It's a revenue
it describes what the purpose is,
Yeah.
and then in the last sentence, it talks about that the proceeds for this fund
Right.
are coming from the state revolving fund,
Yeah.
and then it says, no
Be
impact on the
reimbursed.
tax rate.
Yeah, yes,
Yeah.
yeah, we know all
It's
that.
not coming,
That's
it's
what
not
gets
coming
it-
from the general
That's what
fund.
gets it passed.
But
Yeah.
one of the odd things is when it goes on the ballot, there's non-water users that get to vote this up or down.
Exactly.
And you need a 60% favorable majority. So you're at the mercy of the taxpayers to vote it up or down. However, it is being repaid by just the water users.
Right, so you have to make it very
Or, in this
clear.
case, it's getting repaid by the individual water users that would be receiving the money.
Yeah.
And it would not not only would it not impact the taxpayers, it would not impact the water users.
Yes, who don't need it. So it's basically a revolving line of credit, basically, right?
I've never
All right.
seen one of those not adopted.
Not pass, all
because
right.
Voters are sophisticated. If they're well-educated, they say no impact, no brainer.
Yeah, yeah.
We'd have to have something
Yeah,
ready
yeah, I didn't
by
bring it up
March.
to suggest it couldn't pass, I want to bring it up to suggest that the timeframe for it will probably stretch out into the spring.
But clearly, we need to prioritize, and we need to pass the ordinance and the rate
Yes.
fees at our next meeting. And are there any other things that we need to make a decision on? Like I was looking at, we decided we were going to do quarterly charges. Is that something we need to discuss, or has that already been done? Remote meter reading, all of these other little things. Is that other stuff that needs to be incorporated into that July 20th meeting, besides ordinances and rates?
I think the ordinance already sets up a structure for that.
All right,
And the rates too, the rates that were being proposed suggest it's a quarterly
okay, all right,
quarterly charge and a quarterly system. So by adopting the rates, I think you've covered it.
okay, all right. Go ahead, Jay.
Maybe this was already discussed, I'm new, so. Why quarterly as opposed to monthly? Is there any particular reason?
Cost.
Cost, okay.
I'll start. Mark, I'm sure has thoughts on this too, but we've seen both. I think as a startup, it's a little easier to go quarterly because it's less of an administrative burden. So there is a lower cost to that, as long as you can carry the expenses between billings. Some systems go to monthly billings just to maintain the revenue they need, but they also have sophisticated systems to make it easy. So quarterly is a great start. And then, if things don't work out, it can be changed. But what do you think, Mark?
Well, you're talking about reading meters 4 times a year instead of 12 times a year, and then the corresponding administrative costs. And the cash flow won't be an issue because there is enough in the water fund now that if we needed
Cover it,
to
yeah.
cover, you know, that, that 3 month or the 2 month period to get to the third for the, it wouldn't be a problem. So obviously, I mean, I would even consider if it was every 6 months on the front end, but I mean, quarterly is how it's usually done by municipalities.
Fair enough.
What are we looking at an average cost for the year?
About $630.
So
Well,
$150?
it's 600, plus you need to factor in that $63 charge for a meter. So that adds up to another couple hundred. So it's in the $800.
Let's say $200. That's the cost of some people.
No, just to be clear, I just want to make that point, Mark, that 630 includes both the consumption and the meter charge.
Oh,
So that is the total annual.
So it's in
want
the
that to-
150 range?
Right, so that's, although my comment is that that's a very, very doable bill for most people who have mobile phones and have cable TV and
You're
whatnot.
talking a little over $10 a week. That's
Exactly.
very reasonable.
So
Yeah.
I buy
think
more
quality-
in iced coffee this time of year, a week, than
Yes,
it would for the water.
Yes.
But if you wait 6 months, now it's a bigger bill.
Go ahead, Jay. Go
And
ahead.
people don't manage their funds, it gets tougher for them.
You talk about reading the meters. Is that a manual process, or are the meters smart meters
Well-
where they report back to a system?
So it's actually the new lithium battery-operated meters that they can drive by, and it's a radio signal that's sent.
Oh, okay.
And so we're really on the front end of this. There's communities that have had the regular meters that had to absorb the cost of converting all of their meters in the whole town or city to these new meters, which is a substantial cost. You're talking that capital improvement cost that would be several $100,000 or even greater, maybe $1 million to convert everybody. We can now jump in with that technology now that we know is going to be around for a while. So it was a 50, 60-year-old technology that had to be upgraded to the current. We would jump right on board with the latest technology, and it would be, the meters would be read by a vehicle driving through the neighborhood.
Yep. Good, thank you.
So,
Am I correct, Gene and Keith?
yes.
Yeah, no, that's correct. And you got to remember too, you're only going to have about 100, 200, maybe 400 meters at tops initially. And what used to be done, you know, in Merrimack's, another one of our clients, they have 6,000 meters. It used to take, you know, 2 people 3 or 4 days just to read 1/3 of the system. And that's how they did it on a revolving basis. But now you can drive by, you'd have it done in 2 hours.
So just another factor in the reading the meters every quarter instead of every month. If one of the things you'll be talking about making a decision on is an operations contract. Well, you need to understand that the operations contract would be more money if you read the meters every month as opposed to every quarter. So if you decide to do one thing, it's going to cost you in another.
So if the board has no more questions and there's no more further discussion, I'm going to end this meeting at 8:05, and I look forward to seeing you gentlemen on July 20th, and thank you so much for remoting in on us. We really appreciate that.
And I'm
Julian,
taking-
you have one last
and
question?
I'm taking it,
Go
we're
ahead.
voting on this the next meeting.
On July 20th, yeah, we technically vote on it tonight, but I don't think everybody's really had a chance to look it
No,
over very well.
Technically, it's a
so-
workshop, you can't vote on it.
Okay, all right, so then that takes care of that, but obviously, we will be voting on it on July 20th. So, good night, gentlemen, and thank you, Dee, for
Thank you.
monitoring this.
Thank you.
And we are going to go into a non-public session for a very quick meeting, so I will say good night to our public audience, and I would ask Beth to give us a roll call. I'll end the meeting at 8:05, 8:03, the public meeting.
Okay, I'm assuming you'll kick us out because I don't know how to exit here.
We'll cut you off.
All right.
Okay, thank you. Good night.
Well, thanks for this extra information here.
You don't have to put that on, I know you're not.
John Radigan is going to stay for
I was waiting for him to walk around again.
Sure, sure.
Thank you very much.